Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue reading A Prophet in Babylon with Chapter 23, The Valley of the Shadow. He lay in a narrow bed in an unfamiliar room. The walls were without adornment, the floors bare. There was scarcely more furniture than might be found in a monk's cell. The room breathed an air of austere cleanliness. It produced also the impression of loneliness. 2 high windows let in the light, each framed a patch of blue sky. But for that reassuring patch of sky he might have imagined that he lay in some forgotten vestibule of silence, far from the human world. He listened eagerly for some sound, however trifling, that might assure him that he was not utterly forsaken. For a long time, it seemed a whole day, though it had been but a few seconds, no sound came. Then a bell rang in a distant corridor. He heard a quick footstep, the closing of a door, and the sound of water dripping from a tap. Then an obliterating wave of sleep rolled over him. At first he tried to push it back. Then he yielded to it, though with infinite reluctance. He had the sensation of drowning, of sinking deep and deeper into some element that was strange to him and half repugnant. The sound of water dripping from a tap pursued him. It was a maddening sound. He had recollection of something horrible he had once heard of, a torture by water, a thing much more terrible than torture by fire. Drip, drip, drop. A pause full of menace. Then drip, drip, drop, again, and each drop became a sharp, cold weapon, puncturing its way into the fibers of the brain. Oh, how miraculous relief! The sound became metamorphosed into the noise of running brooks, the rippling of waves along the lakeshore, the regular throb of heavy seas breaking on a beach of sand. It was sunrise, and the brook glittered in the fresh light. It was noon, and the lake shone like glass mingled with fire. It was night, and the stars stooped like fireflies and shone reflected in the smooth green slope of curving waves. And then, again, he heard that insistent drip, drip, drop of water from a tap. The sound once more grew faint, and it seemed now that he was caught away by some swift wind, yet still he dreamed of water. He saw great forests, motionless in the ecstasy of rain, and his delighted body drank through every pore the delicious coolness. The silver drops smote his naked flesh. A dark cloud broke over him in torrents of swift rain. Like Elijah the Tishbite, he ran against the racing deluge, quivering with each shock and buffet of the storm, yet elated, strangely glad. There passed before him, like a rapid panorama, all the scenes which he had ever known, associated with the memory of water. He was a boy again, plunging deep into the dark swimming pool beneath the great elms. Now it was a trout stream he followed, a clear brown stream flowing over golden pebbles. Now it was a lake he saw, shining like a pool of light amid dark woods. From these he was whirled away to scenes immensely distant, yet apparently near. He was sailing on a Swiss lake at sunset. He stood beside an English mountain tarn, over which cool grey clouds gathered. He leaned from a Venetian gondola, trailing his hands in the little waves full of soft green fire. Always water. He could not have enough of it. Every fibre of his body cried for it. And then lake and river faded out. He heard no more the rippling sound of wave or current, only the drip, drip, drop of water from a tap, and he groaned. Suddenly he became aware of a new element in these fantastic wanderings. Was he not really engaged in taking farewell of the world? Yes, that must be it. His spirit, poised for flight, could not go till it had revisited every scene of former emotion or delight. He was like the youth whose faith calls him to a new life in distant lands, who spends his last hours in a pilgrimage of farewell to familiar scenes. He runs from room to room, looks long at each, as if he would impress upon his memory the exact position of each familiar object, paces silently along the garden paths, noting where each flower grows, recollecting childish games, happy follies, tearful silences after rebuke, till every grass blade in the garden, every object in the house, seems to be part of his life and part of its secrets. Even so Gaunt felt his spirit move with the anguish of farewell about the house of life. He could not go until he had visited every place or scene once loved. He must impress them on his memory. It was the only treasure he could take with him into an other world. Then he would go, content. The thought brought with it no fear. Neither did it create any sense of wonder or anticipation. He had become a creature without volition. He lay quite passive now, like a tired swimmer who can strive no more. He felt a faint sense of disappointment that dying, if indeed this were dying, should after all prove an affair so commonplace. It seemed to him that in those days of health and strength, which were so incredibly remote, he had always thought of this hour as something intense, sublime, even ecstatic. There should surely be heavenly voices, soft music, the air winnowed by angel wings, the opening of the gates of dawn, and behold, it was nothing more than a quiet sense of sinking in a soft wave, an infinite composure, a delicious relaxation of nerves and muscles, tired with long effort. He found himself smiling both at his former terrors and his former hopes. The strangest thing of all appeared to be the completeness and the rapidity with which his relations to the world had altered. He remembered that he had once been very eager and anxious about a multitude of matters, the very nature of which he could not recall. All these things seemed quite unimportant now. The world was like a ship that had sunk at sea. Utter silence and oblivion had closed over that strenuous, busy shipload of life. There lay around him only the silence of the stars, and the infinite curve of the far horizon. It seemed incredible that he had ever lived among voices, tasks, duties, fierce exigencies, cruel perturbations. They had dwindled into such nothingness that he could hardly believe they had existed. If they did exist, which he doubted, he could not wish again to move among them. In some marvelous way he had attained to ultimate tranquillity. Why should he renounce it? Whereupon a long and painful argument arose in his mind. It seemed that far down in some dark corner of his consciousness, a persistent voice bade him live. It affirmed his power to live. It affirmed his duty. He strove weakly to resist it, yet all the while he felt as though the tide beneath him had turned, and was slowly drifting him back to the shores of life. He was no longer at peace, no longer sinking quietly in a deep sea of sleep. Something harsh and violent clutched at him. A weight of grey horror pressed upon his eyeballs. A flash of flaming pain ran along his nerves. He shuddered, cried, and woke. His eyes took in slowly the reality of things tangible. Stone-colored walls, a yellow floor on which a spot of sunlight lay, 2 high windows, each with a patch of blue sky. And once more he heard the sound of a bell far away, and the drip, drip, drop of water from a tap. Suddenly he became aware of certain human figures that stood beside him and stooped over him. One was a grave, dark figure. There were 2 others dressed in white. They were speaking among themselves in a low whisper. He felt a strong desire to communicate with them. His lips framed agonized interrogations, but to his dismay no sound was audible. It was clear they could not hear him, for they did not turn to him, and yet it seemed to him that he was shouting. A horrible conviction seized him that he was already forgotten, as a dead man, out of mind. What surer proof of death could there be than this utter failure of his to communicate with the living? He summoned all his strength for a more intense effort at speech. The sweat stood out upon his forehead, and the muscles of his throat ached. The effort was vain. He had not been heard. The figure seemed to dissolve, to withdraw, and at last entirely vanish. He was once more alone in some intangible and dim world, which impressed him by its vagueness and its vastness. At first he was conscious of a quality that was almost pleasure. Time and space were alike gone. His body was volatile. It floated like a feather here and there upon the obscure wind. It seemed part of the vagueness and vastness, a floating bubble on the waves of an eternal sea. The sense of pleasure which he felt was derived from his own entire impotence. He was no longer required to strive and struggle. There was no goal that he sought to win. The imperious need for doing and acting, once so strong in him, was wholly gone. Things were done to him. Things were done for him. He himself did nothing. He lay calm in effortless quiescence. He floated in an element of peace ineffable. He had no desires, no hopes, no fears. He was beyond them all. They came back, however. This was the misery, that they always came back. Just when the sweet intoxication of his utter restlessness seemed complete, it always happened that the spell was broken. Something tugged at his heartstrings. A turning of some minute wheel in the loom of life knitted the reluctant nerves to tenseness, and he became again a creature who willed and strove. A sense of some imminent, tremendous issues in which he was concerned traumatized him. It was like the far-off sound of trumpets in the ear of the stricken soldier on the field. He must need arise and obey. His whole shattered strength reunited itself at the imperious sound. He dared not die. He fought his way, half strangled, through the folds of that delicious innervation. He found his strength by an effort that seemed to rend him asunder. He felt a sudden scorn of restfulness. And then, once more, he saw a blue patch of sky grow into distinctness, and heard the drip-drop of water from a tap. He woke half weeping over his deliverance. These ebbings to and fro of consciousness continued for a long time. At last there came a brief period of entire clearness of vision. It was midnight. A shaded lamp stood upon the floor, casting opaque shadows. A woman with a kind, firm face bent over him and felt his pulse. His eye rapidly scanned the scene, the straight, narrow bed, the bare, stone-colored walls, the dim light, the white-dressed woman stooping over him, and he realized he was in a hospital. "Have I been ill?" he whispered. "Yes, but you are better now," she answered. "Am I going to die?" The woman did not answer. She left his room for a moment, returning with the doctor. In that brief interval he had realized his condition. He had realized also that in a way the final choice between death and life rested with himself. Man dieth not wholly, but by the death of the will, he thought. Therefore God gives me the choice. Instantly he made his choice. He would live. He must needs summon all his energies in the effort to live. The most primal of all instincts, this effort to live, reasserted itself in him. A great horror of physical annihilation swept over him. He was conscious of powers and faculties which called for expression in the world of men, a work not done, of work that waited to be done. The words of ancient kings of Jerusalem leapt to his lips. For Sheol cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee. They that go down to the pit cannot hope for thy truth. The living, he shall praise thee, as I do this day. Gaunt clung to life as a man climbing out of some black chasm clings to every small projection in the precipice that is crowned with the upper day. In that strip of blue day, far above him, familiar faces shone radiant. From that bright summit voices of encouragement saluted him, and it seemed to him that God, approving his decision, put a strong arm around him and helped him upward. He smiled for joy. Again and again he was swept back toward the abyss, but he never lost the vision of that shining summit. As he grew stronger, his passion for the visible human world grew more intense, till it was almost painful. He found food for wonder in the commonest features of human life. The sound of wheels and footsteps on the street set him thinking of the mystery of locomotion. To move, to walk, by a mute signal of the will that set all this involved machinery of the body traveling hither and thither. It seemed a miracle indeed to him, who lay there so inert and impotent. He fancied that if he ever walked again, he would count each step a special revelation of God's grace, and thank him for it. And he blamed himself that he had been unthankful for the precious gift of physical activity in the days of health. He watched with painful eagerness for each succeeding daybreak. Night was his Gethsemane. Each night seemed insurmountable, hostile, malevolent, a road of agonies. But oh, the exquisite relief when the cold blue light of day began to fill the room. It was as though a foe had departed, a friend had come. And how wonderful seemed that mere shining of the sun. Outside the window a great elm rose, and he watched like an eager child for the moment when the first ray of sunrise smote it, when the blue dawn light became suffused with soft gray, when at last the first long golden spear of splendor pierced the bosom of the tree, and made each leaf a green quivering flame. He could have clapped his hands, and had a company of angels moved amid the foliage, each brow aureoled in light. It had not seemed a greater miracle. When the day had thus come, he usually fell asleep, for then only did he feel content and safe. He had gone back to childhood. Like a child, he had become dependent on others for all the offices of life. It seemed a strange thing at first, thus to be girded by others whom he knew not, but he soon grew reconciled to it. He often found a certain comfort in his dependence. Through it he came to realize a more composed faith in God. For if these men and women, who knew him only as a patient, were so kind, if their skill and vigilance were always at his call, if he could learn to lean on them with such reposeful confidence, how much more might he lean on God, who loves to bear the human burden? And in those hours there came to him also a new and special sense of sympathy with all suffering. He had never before endured the violence of pain. He had never had any vivid sense of that tremendous part which pain plays in the lives of men. Now, for the first time, he realized the terrible significance of the apostolic word, quote, "The whole creation travaileth together in pain," unquote. The thought overwhelmed him. Yet its final effect was not dismay. It was a sense of comradeship with all the myriad of lives that suffered. He had been made free of the city of anguish. He had acquired citizenship with the children of pain and those who lay in the shadow of death. Henceforth he must prove his citizenship by new sympathy. Himself initiated into the brotherhood of pain, he must prove his brotherhood in service. So vivid was his sense of this new duty that he questioned if anyone could have a real sense of sympathy with suffering who had not himself suffered. And perhaps the clearest proof that there is a ministry in pain was this change of temper which pain had wrought in him. How often had he heard of this or that man who had vanished behind the gates of suffering, and had heard without emotion, because his own vision could not pass those gates. How often had he passed beneath the walls of a hospital on joyous feet, with scarce a glance at the high windows, indeed without recollection of what the place was, and of all its poignant significance. But this could never happen again. Henceforth and always, when he passed a hospital, it would be on tiptoe and with bared head. It would be with a gush of silent prayer for all who suffered, and with a thrill of reverence for those who served within the walls. It would be with the awe of a disciple revisiting the hill of Calvary and meditating on the cross. And so there came to him something more than an enlarged experience. There came to him a fuller sense of the beauty and sanctity that dwelt in human life. Looking into the tomb where corruption lay, he found a garden of lilies, had seen a vision of angels, had received a new assurance of something immortal that stirred beneath the muddy vesture of mortality. And that's the end of chapter 23. Next week we will read the final chapter, chapter 24, Perfect Love. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.